East Germany, 1970s. Behind the Iron Curtain, political prisoners were being forced to work in factories and prison workshops. Some of the products and components they helped manufacture would eventually make their way into IKEA's supply chain. For years, IKEA built its reputation on affordable furniture. But behind some of those low prices was a supply chain connected to one of the most brutal labor systems in communist Europe. And the disturbing part is this. IKEA eventually admitted that political prisoners had been involved in producing parts for its products. The story began decades before the scandal became public. In the 1970s and 1980s, IKEA was expanding rapidly. The company needed furniture that could be produced cheaply and in huge quantities. West European manufacturing was expensive. East Germany was different. The German Democratic Republic, the GDR, had a large industrial system, cheap labor, and a government willing to arrange production for Western companies. But there was a hidden workforce inside that system: prisoners. The East German state routinely forced prisoners to work. That included political prisoners, people imprisoned for opposing or challenging the communist regime. And some of that prison labor entered commercial supply chains, serving Western companies. IKEA was one of them. The system was complicated. IKEA generally did not walk into a prison and directly order prisoners to build furniture. Instead, the company dealt with East German suppliers and state-controlled trading organizations. Those organizations controlled production. They controlled access, and they controlled the information reaching Western companies. That distinction became important years later, because IKEA could argue that it had not knowingly ordered political prisoners to work on its products. But the evidence showed something more uncomfortable. IKEA had reasons to know. By the 1980s, information about prisoners being involved in production had reached IKEA representatives. The company took steps to try to prevent political prisoners from being used. But according to the later investigation, those measures were not effective enough. The supply chain continued operating through a system where IKEA had limited access to the actual workplaces. And that meant the company was relying heavily on assurances from the East German authorities and suppliers. The very people controlling the system were also controlling the information about what was happening inside it. Then the Berlin Wall fell. November 9th, 1989. East Germany collapsed, the Cold War ended, and the records of the old regime slowly began opening up. But the IKEA story stayed largely buried until former prisoners started talking. They described being forced to work under prison conditions and producing goods connected to Western companies. In 2012, Swedish television brought renewed attention to allegations that IKEA products had been manufactured using forced prison labor in East Germany. The story exploded, and IKEA had a decision to make: ignore it, deny it, or investigate its own past. The company chose investigation. IKEA commissioned Ernst & Young to examine its historical records. Investigators went through IKEA documents, German archives, and testimony from former employees and witnesses. The investigation examined tens of thousands of records, and the conclusion was difficult to dismiss. Political prisoners and ordinary prisoners had been involved in producing components and parts for IKEA-related production in the former East Germany. The company acknowledged that its previous measures had failed to prevent this. IKEA publicly expressed deep regret. But there was an important detail. The investigation did not simply conclude that IKEA executives knowingly designed a system to exploit political prisoners. The reality was more complicated. IKEA had knowledge that prisoners could be involved. The company attempted to stop it, but those controls failed, and the company continued doing business within a system where forced labor was being used. That created the central question: how much responsibility does a company have when it benefits from a system it failed to properly investigate? That question went far beyond IKEA, because IKEA was not the only Western company connected to East German prison labor. The East German government had turned forced prison labor into part of its economic system, and Western companies could benefit from the cheap production. For the prisoners, however, this wasn't an accounting problem. It was their lives. Former political prisoners described working under coercive conditions. Some were punished for failing to meet production targets. One former prisoner later described being subjected to severe punishment when production requirements were not met. These weren't ordinary employees who could simply quit. They were prisoners, and the state controlled almost every part of their existence. Their labor was not voluntary. It was forced. Then came another uncomfortable realization. IKEA had built its business around a simple proposition: good design at affordable prices. That business model depended on efficient global production, but the East German episode revealed the danger hidden inside complicated supply chains. A company can know who its supplier is, but still not know who is actually making the product. And when governments control the factories, the workers, and the information, a Western company can be several steps removed from the people doing the actual work. That distance can make exploitation almost invisible. IKEA eventually acknowledged that what happened was unacceptable. The company said it did not have the control systems it has today, and had not done enough to prevent political prisoners from being used by former suppliers. It also supported further research into forced labor in the former GDR, and discussed contributing to efforts involving victims. The company later developed much stricter supplier requirements and auditing systems. But the historical question remained: why did it take decades for the full story to emerge? Because the real story isn't simply that IKEA used forced labor. It's that modern global business can hide responsibility behind layers of suppliers, governments, contractors, and intermediaries. IKEA was operating inside a dictatorship. The East German state controlled the labor system. The suppliers controlled the factories. And IKEA depended on information coming through that chain. But when political prisoners ended up producing components connected to IKEA, the company benefited from that production, whether or not every executive understood exactly who was doing the work. And that is what makes the story so uncomfortable. Today, IKEA is one of the world's most recognizable furniture brands. Walk into one of its stores, and the experience feels completely different from a Cold War prison workshop. Clean designs, bright rooms, affordable furniture, a carefully controlled global supply chain. But buried inside the company's history is a chapter that IKEA itself eventually had to confront. In the factories and prison workshops of communist East Germany, prisoners were forced to work, and some of what they produced entered the supply chains of one of the world's biggest furniture companies. The scandal didn't destroy IKEA, but it forced the company to confront a question every global corporation eventually faces. When your business stretches across thousands of suppliers, how far does your responsibility extend? Because sometimes, the darkest part of a company's history isn't what happened in its headquarters. It's what happened several steps down the supply chain, where the people doing the work had no choice, and where the people buying the products didn't know their story.